7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. Our top story this evening, the United States has released a report claiming Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman approved the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi 3 years ago. Among an announcement of several Saudi sanctions, none of which are against the prince directly, the Biden administration intelligence report says bin Salman signed off on Khashoggi's either, quote, capture or kill. The Saudi Arabian government has responded, calling the report, quote, negative, false, and unacceptable. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has accused the Armenian military of an attempted coup after the nation's military pressured him to resign. Pashinyan has faced intense protests after Armenia lost control of most of Nagorno-Karabakh following a short but bloody war late last year. Pashinyan urged his supporters to gather in the Armenian capital of Yerevan and was later seen among thousands of supporters in the city's Republic Square. A rival demonstration broke out in the same area, demanding the ousting of Pashinyan. Despite high tensions, though, both protests remained peaceful. Pashinyan, a former journalist, took control of the country following a peaceful revolution in 2018. He has survived several attempts at removal by the Armenian parliament. What was known to be a symbol of the Trump-era immigration restrictions has turned a new page. The first asylum seekers from a Mexican border camp entered the United States on Thursday. The group was comprised of 27 people who had been living in a border camp in Matamoros, Mexico. Residents remained living there under former President Donald Trump's migrant protection protocols, a program that required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for U.S. court hearings. The Biden administration has introduced a new process that will allow thousands of MPP asylum seekers to wait for a decision in the United States. And nearly 79 inmates have died in riots in 4 prisons across Ecuador. General Edmundo Moncayo, head of Ecuador's prison system, announced that the violence began as of Tuesday between opposing drug gangs. The rivalry began by a claim of hierarchy from a local gang by the name of Los Chaneros. Officials had been tipped off by Ecuador's national police force that inmates had possession of 2 firearms smuggled by a guard who were planning to kill the leaders of Los Chaneros. Videos have been circulating on social media showing mutilated bodies after riots broke out. Moncayo is in the works of presenting a plan to the Constitutional Court of Ecuador to help prevent violence within South American prisons. An Italian man in Germany was detained for threatening multiple bombing attacks. 33-year-old Amir Empreda threatened to bomb NHS hospitals, Black Lives Matter rallies, and UK members of parliament. He demanded 10 million euros worth in Bitcoin to not carry out the attack. He made the threats in the summer of 2020 and was finally sentenced to 3 years in German prison. Shimaima Begum, a British national who left the United Kingdom to join ISIS as a teenager, will not be allowed to return to the UK. The ruling was handed down by the UK Supreme Court on February 26th and is the latest development in a long legal battle between Begum and the British government. Begum left the United Kingdom at the age of 15 to join the Islamic State and was later found by a Times journalist in a northern Syrian refugee camp. She has since been attempting to return to the United Kingdom and restore her British citizenship, largely to no avail. The BBC has discovered parts of the Amazon rainforest have been illegally sold on Facebook markets. Parts of the rainforest, some described as large as 1,000 football pitches, include parts of the rainforest and land reserved for indigenous peoples. Facebook released a statement saying they would aid authorities, but will not take personal action to stop the transactions. Sticking to media, Australia has passed legislation that will charge tech companies, such as Facebook and Google, for news content shared on their platforms. The News Media Bargaining Code was introduced after an investigation by Australia's consumer protection body found local advertisers were spending more on tech firms than local companies. Facebook had previously pulled all news sharing to Australian users and blocked access to Australian news sites over the proposed legislation, but reversed the decision after further negotiation with authorities. The law is thought to be the first of its kind, and lawmakers in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom have already expressed interest in passing similar legislation. And starting March 1st, the accordance of visa requirements signed by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine and the government of Grenada will go into effect. The Ukrainian State Agency for Tourism and Development noted that citizens of both countries are exempted from needing a visa for, quote, entry, stay, departure, and transit. Citizens from both countries will be able to travel without visas for a period of 90 days within 180 days. Both countries agreed this would help in simplifying the border crossing regime and strengthen their relationships. A Tanzanian member of parliament has finally been acquitted after insulting their president. Halima Mdee was found not guilty in a Tanzanian court after being accused of calling for the end of the current president's administration. Mdee lost her seat in last year's election because of the charges, but will now reclaim her seat in parliament as part of the opposition party. And now for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to WRHU reporter Connor Donnelly. Connor?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Connor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is defending recent quarantine measures on international travelers after facing criticism for the plan. Under the guidelines, visitors from 33 different countries must pay for their own 10-day quarantine in a hotel before being allowed to move throughout the country. He says the measure is needed to prevent the introduction of new COVID variants, such as the Brazilian strain. In Belgium, over 60 inmates at the Namur prison have tested positive for the virus, nearly half of the population of the facility. Family members of the incarcerated are protesting against the lifting of visitation rights, as well as the lockdown measures imposed. Inmates will not be allowed showers or time outside their cell for the duration of the lockdown, instead being delivered hygiene products each day. In Latin America, Brazil's capital Brasilia has gone on lockdown for all but essential businesses as the city's intensive care wards hit maximum capacity. District Governor Ibanez Rocha says the lockdown will continue until the situation is under control. The order specifically addressed bars and restaurants, which officials blame for the recent spread. Brazil remains the hardest hit country in Latin America with over 250,000 deaths. In Mexico, the doctor in charge of the country's response to COVID-19, Hugo Lopez-Gatell, has tested positive for the virus. Lopez-Gatell has been in the hospital for the last 5 days, but says he is doing well. Meanwhile, Mexican President Manuel López Obrador is set to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden about access to the vaccine supplies across borders. In the Middle East, Iran has crossed 60,000 COVID deaths and more than 1.6 million cases. The grim milestone coincides with the arrival of 250,000 doses of the Sinopharm vaccine, donated by the government of China. Iran has begun vaccinating medical staff and essential workers with imported vaccines, while it works on the development of at least 3 domestic models. In Egypt, Minister of Health Hala Zayed announced the start of an online registration system for distributing COVID vaccines. Eligible groups include the elderly and those with certain medical conditions. Egypt has been using a mix of the Sinopharm and AstraZeneca vaccines as available. Egypt has been moderately impacted by the virus with just under 200,000 cases and 10,000 deaths. Moving over to Asia, China is facing delays on its domestic vaccine rollout due to reluctance from citizens and slow distribution. Beijing doctor, speaking anonymously to the Financial Times, says that only about 20% of hospital staff have received the vaccine so far. Certain state-owned enterprises have begun requiring vaccine sign-up as a condition for employment. The 2 largest domestic vaccine producers say they plan to have 2 billion doses ready by the end of the year. In India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has received the vaccine live in front of media to increase domestic confidence in their safety. He received the Indian-developed Covaxin vaccine. India has been heavily affected by the virus with over 157,000 deaths. And in Africa, the International COVID Vaccine Plan, COVAX, has begun, with its rollout in the Ivory Coast and Ghana. The plan aims to donate vaccines to the developing world in the hopes of achieving global herd immunity. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo became the first person to receive the vaccine as part of the scheme. Previously, the African Centers for Disease Control has expressed concern that some nations did not have the adequate infrastructure to distribute the vaccine domestically. Under the COVAX plan, more than 2 billion doses will be distributed throughout the globe within 1 year. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Connor Donnelly. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just joining us, you're tuned in to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. Before we move on, viewers and listeners, please be advised the following conversations contain sensitive material relating to violence and sexual assault that some may find triggering. This week, we're discussing the ongoing conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. To explain the conflict itself and global implications of it, I spoke with Steve Feldstein, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So I'd like to get right into it. My first question for you is just, can you explain the Tigray region conflict for those that might not know what's going on right now?
Yeah, sure. So Ethiopia is made up of a number of different ethnic groups that comprise the whole country, and Tigray happens to be the home base for a very significant group, the Tigrayans, who for a number of years were responsible for running the country, running Ethiopia. They have come out of power in the last few years once the new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came into power. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of tension where they want to assert their own autonomy. Abiy wants to make sure he can assert control over the entire country. And there's been a simmering tension essentially between the leadership in Tigray and the prime minister of the country. And that simmering tension most recently boiled over in the fall of last year, around October, where you actually started seeing armed conflict take place between the Tigrayans, who are based up north in that part of the country, and the Ethiopian military.
Some have labeled this a civil war. Would you categorize this as such?
I mean, I think it's a fair assessment. It's not a civil war in the sense that the entire country isn't embroiled in conflict, but it is very much a conflict that resulted in a huge amount of casualties, displacement, and it's one that's been ongoing. The hostilities still haven't ceased. And in fact, it's even become internationalized in the sense that Eritrean troops from across the border have also become involved. So in that sense, at least for that part of the country, it certainly is a civil conflict.
And Ethiopia's prime minister, whom you just mentioned, has called members of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, domestic terrorists. What are your thoughts on that label?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of hyperbole, I would say. Certainly, on a political level, he has been at odds with the TPLF, who he has felt have tried to undermine his rule for several years. So there is a real, there's a real set of grievances. There's a past that they have where the two sides on a political level really don't get along, and the rhetoric has been heated, and it's gotten worse. And then, of course, things have finally boiled over into open conflict. So, whether or not, however you want to label it, the fact of the matter is both sides have been responsible for significant hostilities and casualties. Right now, we have an ongoing humanitarian disaster that's taking place in that region. And, the steps that are needed to restore, basic services to the region, to provide medical services, water, food security, and so forth, let alone peace to the region, those really haven't been taken. And so I think the bottom line is that we're just seeing an ongoing, continuing humanitarian crisis that shows no signs of really letting up at the moment.
For those of you just joining us, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, here on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. Right now, we're speaking with Steve Feldstein about the ongoing conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Steve is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're talking a little bit about what is going on right now, the basics. Mr. Feldstein, can you tell us a little bit about the communication blackout that's going on right now and how that's impacting civilians?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And this is actually a pattern and something I've thought a lot about across the world when it comes to what do internet shutdowns mean, why do governments implement them, and what is their consequence. But, in Ethiopia, internet shutdowns are a pretty regular occurrence that occur either when the government is trying to break the back of protests and prevent them from communicating, or oftentimes in conjunction with an armed operation. So that's what's happened in Tigray. Essentially, once the conflict boiled over in October, the Ethiopian government cut off internet communication and really led to a communications blackout in the region. And unfortunately, even after the conflict has started to subside a little bit, in terms of the first few weeks of the conflict, communication has not been restored, and that's a really dangerous thing. It prevents people internally from being able to know what parts of the area are safer. It doesn't allow people to find out where they can access much needed humanitarian services. And generally, it also prevents the international community and outsiders from knowing the scope of the humanitarian disaster that's taking place, and also where actual massacres and human rights violations are occurring, except for people reporting on the ground and then sending that information out via other channels.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, the Council on Foreign Relations has just released a report very recently on refugees, that over 60,000 refugees have fled the region and nearly 500,000 have been displaced. What are the implications of this on neighboring countries? Do you think it's possible they'll return home? What about internal infrastructure? How are refugees, displaced people how does that impact the internal atmosphere?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really just disastrous for everyone all around. I mean, there's a few different implications that come from this. First of all, some of the countries that people are fleeing to, notably Sudan, are not exactly places that have a strong infrastructure anyway to handle for the long term an influx of people. So you're already stressing a system in a neighboring country that is ill prepared to deal with it. And if you think about the displaced persons themselves in terms of lacking basic access to the type of services that are needed, over the long term, this can be extremely damaging, both in terms of their community cohesion and in terms of the educational outcomes of their children, not to mention their own livelihoods. So certainly it's I think a really tragic situation that we're seeing right now when it comes to the refugee outflows that we're witnessing. I think the question in terms of what happens and can we find a way to kind of bring back the situation back to some state of normalcy, well, that really is, I think, contingent on the armed and political conflict finding a resolution. So far, what it seems to me that's happening is that we've taken a very high tempo, high intensity level of conflict, and now it's sort of transformed into a more low-lying insurgency that continues to persist, especially in kind of the countryside, and that there's enough atrocities that are occurring, including a new report from Amnesty International tracing atrocities committed by the Eritrean soldiers, that this serves as a really big disincentive for people to say, well, I think it's safe to go back to my homes. I think the government that's in charge will take care of me. On the contrary, the message is essentially go back home at your own risk, but watch out. The possibility that you or your family will face human rights violations, potentially slaughter, is very real. And so these are precisely the wrong signals, I think, that would give people confidence to say, okay, returning home is something that will make sense in the near future.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, here at 88.7 FM and around the world on WRHU.org. We're here right now talking about the Ethiopia conflict in the Tigray region with Steve Feldstein, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I want to shift now to long-term issues and potential damage. What are some of the long-term effects that this conflict itself might have on the region?
Right. Well, there's really, you got to kind of ask yourself, what is the political end game? And how do you sort of build back people's confidence, Tigrayans' confidence in the government, that it will be a government that will actually protect their needs and respond and provide the services that are necessary? I think, a really big issue that people have been concerned about is the fact that will Tigrayans as a broader ethnic group start to become persecuted on a more systemic level throughout the country because of the sharp divisions that have emerged as a result of this conflict, and the fact that so many casualties are being absorbed on all sides. You can't sort of end first of all, the conflict doesn't seem to be ending in the near term. And second of all, you need to find a pathway towards reconciliation and dialogue. And those don't seem to be on the table at the moment. And so the longer you sort of let this type of situation persist, where there's no real resolution in sight, and there doesn't seem to be a real inclination to sort of bring back different groups, the Tigrayans and others, into dialogue, I think the more you sort of set a pattern that will have long-lasting effects in terms of unity for the country. And the other thing I would also say is that, it's not as if the Tigrayans are the only ethnic group, in Ethiopia. There's many other groups, a number of which have different issues and grievances. And when you start to let some of that boil over, you can see where the difficulties might lie in the future. There already is a history of tensions that have simmered in different parts of the country and continue to simmer outside of Tigray. And so what I think the precedent that this sets for some of these other conflicts in the country doesn't augur well either.
And you already mentioned the potential issues with Sudan taking in refugees. You've mentioned other countries sending in troops that have been committing atrocities. But what are some of the effects that this could have on relations within a globalized world, even for either for neighboring countries or trade, economics? What are the implications for this on a global scale?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think that for when Abiy first came into power, and really up through, like middle of last year, I think there was a lot of optimism that Abiy was a reformer, that he was looking to really help accelerate innovation, industrialization in the country, that it was actually that Ethiopia was poised for big things and that he was willing to liberalize a number of elements in order to allow that to happen, to spawn innovation, to spawn prosperity, to kind of move Ethiopia forward as a shining example of what can happen in that part of the world. And now we're seeing a lot of that, I think, in danger of being undermined by a conflict that has, potentially could escalate to encompass many more elements. It doesn't seem to be resolved in the near future. And I think the international reputation of Ethiopia and Abiy in particular is starting to suffer. This obviously is taking a lot of his time and resources when it comes to trying to figure out how to deal with the conflict. And as a result of that, the effect is that you're taking away from the needed investment, the prioritization of different economic issues, the building out of internet connectivity, all these sorts of things that are necessary for a country to thrive in the 21st century. These are things that are being potentially set aside because this conflict is really consuming so much resources and time and attention.
For those of you just joining us, you're tuned into Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, joined right now talking about the Ethiopia conflict with Steve Feldstein, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I want to shift gears again to the question on everybody's mind, which is how does Ethiopia get out of such a conflict? How do they start to recover? How does this end? The United Nations and other key peacekeeping forces have already taken measures to try and calm relations right now in the region. Has this helped? Has this hurt?
Yeah, no, certainly the engagement of the international community is absolutely necessary. And while things are dire, I think they would be in a far worse position if the type of life-saving humanitarian assistance that's being provided and the pressure from international actors, whether it's from the UN or other powers, to really pressure Abiy to at least allow greater humanitarian access and other sorts of necessary items to keep things from boiling over into an even worse crisis. I think these are elements that are having an important effect. So certainly, I think that one side is sort of how do you staunch the bleeding, right? Like what can you do in the near term to ensure that things don't get significantly worse, that things don't deteriorate. That's step one. Step two is then, well, what do you need to do to actually just restore the needed infrastructure to start to build the confidence so people will begin to consider returning back home? What can you do to actually find a way out, a solution politically to where things stand? And then, further along the lines, like, what type of dialogue do you need? What kind of political rapprochement is necessary so that there isn't sort of a long-standing set of tensions and issues of conflict in the region that will prevent Tigray from returning back to more of a state of normalcy? I mean, these are all really outstanding questions without easy answers, but part of it stems from, Abiy's inclination and commitment to opening up the possibility of dialogue with the right leaders in the region.
In a perfect world, what would you see happen? How do you think that this resolves?
Well, there aren't any easy answers, and unfortunately, so much of this is wrapped up in a history and tensions inherent in the Ethiopian state. So I can't sort of offer up 2 or 3 easy solutions so that things can get back to where they need to go. But I think, in any sort of situation where you have 2 groups that are now dogged by, real differences when it comes to their political visions and a feeling that they can't coexist with one another, you have to find a way to break down, those barriers and sort of say, here's what coexistence can look like. Here are arrangements and confidence building measures that can be put in place so that we can live together side by side once more in some sort of federation within Ethiopia. And so you really are at a point where you're sort of starting from the basics right now. There's so little trust at this point. There is such an amount of difficulty. I mean, I think one thing to start with is I think communication, accountability, and transparency along with dialogue. That means accounting for the atrocities that have occurred, transparency about what has occurred with regard to the conflict, and then making sure that you can use that as a pathway to communicate amongst the different stakeholders in the government and in Tigray. What is the political settlement needed to move things onto firmer ground?
Is there anything else? I know we talked about a lot of different aspects of this issue, but is there anything else that you think is important to note or add?
Yeah, I just think that the whole situation is just so unfortunate. And it's really hard to pinpoint one particular set of actors. I think at some point, every side kind of got locked into sort of a conflict spiral. I was in Mekelle in Tigray last year in February. I was doing field research for a book I was writing about digital repression. And, when I was there, I was really struck by the rhetoric from the Tigray leaders that I spoke to. Their feeling that they were isolated, their expression of grievances against the government, their belief that there was no future in terms of any kind of settlement with Abiy. And so, while I was still surprised to see hostilities come out in such a way in which they did in the fall, in some ways it also felt a little bit like an inevitability that both sides were pushing the rhetoric in such a way that conflict would eventually be the end result. And that's where we are. And I just think it's such a sad thing for where Ethiopia sits and for the people in Tigray overall.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate it and all of your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Steve Feldstein from the CEIP for that expertise. To get a first-hand perspective of what's going on the ground, I spoke with Colgate Associate Professor Engeda Hagos, whose entire family, mother, father, aunts, uncles, cousins, childhood friends, are all living in the area. Again, please be warned, some of the things we discussed are sensitive, containing topics of violence and sexual assault. Fantastic. So my first question for you, just to get right into it, could you share some of the experiences that your relatives have had in the Tigray region right now?
Okay. I think there was a glitch. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. So my first question for you is just, can you share, sorry, my whole thing just quit out. Can you just share for me some of the experiences that your relatives have had in the Tigray region?
Thank you so much, Eli, for having me today on your broadcast. I have many relatives in Tigray, from where the capital city is Mekelle. My immediate siblings are there. My parents are an hour away from that. And then a lot of my uncles and other relatives are in the western region. So I can give you perspectives on them. So I have not able to talk to my parents and my siblings for almost 3 months. I just connected a couple weeks ago, and I didn't know whether they were alive or not. So when the phone call was connected, I heard a very bad news about 2 of my closest cousins were killed. on the street. One was actually killed while he was holding his 3-month-old baby in front of his wife. So it was very heartbreaking. Also, all my childhood friends, I know since I was a child, went to school together there, was also assassinated, many of them. So those are the one, they are really immediate affected. Also, my parents, who are really very old, my dad is 92 and my mom is about 86. And then both of them are really dependent on medications. My mom takes blood pressure medications and my dad is a diabetic, so he get insulin injection. So both are really suffering during the war because there was a limited amount. The government was really blocking everything going to the region for many months, even beyond the war was started, and there was a medication problem. But even during the war, where my parents are resident, there was no access for medication, and because of people scared, everyone in the town was escaped. They get out from the town and they went to the bush, and both my parents was left alone without help for over 10 days. So this is really disturbing, for me and for many diaspora. This is my story, but there are the same stories in each household. You can hear the same kinds of problems. In terms of food and clean water and sanitation, the same problem. There was no electricity for a long period of time. There was no any access for the people. So there was a big problem in sanitation. There was a big problem in terms of getting clean waters and then even food they eat.
For those of you just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm here right now with professor at Colgate University, Engadda Hagos, who's telling us right now about his family's experiences on the ground in the Tigray region. Professor, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't even imagine how it must feel to be here. Can you dive into those emotions of what it's like to be here in the United States while the rest of your family is suffering?
So it was really tough. It was really the problem with this war is you are not able to communicate with your family at all. We don't really know. I didn't know. Like I said, not only me, but a lot of diaspora from that region. We didn't know. We have no idea. All we were like hearing a little bit of news is from the people they fled from Tigray to Sudan. And there was reporters there because there is no access for international reporters back then. So that we were hopeless. So I can tell you, the past 3 months, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't even be myself. I was really struggling. There is huge depression among many diaspora, including myself, regarding this. So I think the psychological impact happened to many diaspora, including myself, is really very difficult even to recover. Some diaspora, even they lost their life due to this stress. Some of them end up in hospitals, so it is really psychologically troubling, and still there is no hope because still the war is still going on. And then there are a lot of limitation access to that region. For the past 2 weeks, for instance, almost 10 days, there were no electricity. The electricity is again, blacked out, no internet. The phone service are connected with that, so we couldn't. So it's still, we live in fear. I live in fear, like what is going to happen to my family, are they going to get their medication on time? Are they going to eat food and having clean water, the basic necessity, of life? So it's really wearing not only for the past 3 months, but still it's very frustrating.
Do you ever get the urge to go to the region to be with them?
It's impossible. So one of the big problem on this war is the government is not only creating problem in that region, but also arresting people from that region. So a lot of Tigrayans, live even other places in the capital city, in Addis Ababa, for instance, were arrested just because they are from Tigray. Their bank account was closed because they are from Tigray. So they are in concentration camp. More than 60,000 Tigrayan was arrested in any other than Tigray regions. You can imagine, you can have money in your bank, right? But you are not able to feed your family because of the bank is denying you because of your ethnicity. So there are a lot of people, no matter where their citizenship. There are people, they are US citizens, they are European citizens. They were really arrested at the airport. Later they released them, but there was a lot of problems. So I was really scared. I couldn't go because if I go, I probably going to end up in prison, or maybe some kind of problem is going to occur on myself. So going there is, at this point, is impossible to do it.
And you've mentioned the psychological and mental damage that the conflict has done. What kind of physical damage? I mean, how are your relatives' homes? Where are they staying?
So my relatives are, the one in the capital city, Mekelle, relatively, although there are people killed there, relatively it's okay because there are Red Cross and other international agencies. So the Eritrean government and the Ethiopian government's armies are not killing as much in Mekelle, and a lot of people are not displaced. Rather, from the West, I told you some of my families are still there. Uncles and nieces are, we don't know. They can't back to their places again because everybody in the city, they went to the bush because they were bombing for 5 days, no fighting. In each city, nobody really fights. The guerrilla fighters or the TPLF were not fighting with them. They left the cities, but they were just bombing for 5 consecutive days for each of them. Many people are lost their life due to that. So the people are scared and they were abandoned their home. So about 2.2 million people are really displaced in Tigray alone, internally. So in the Western, I have no idea because I don't have any communication. I get a chance to talk to my mother last time, and I asked her how her relatives, because most of her relatives are in the Western region, and she said she has no idea. Maybe they are alive, maybe they are dead, maybe I don't know whether they are eating food or not. So that problem is still occurring there. So I think not only my family, but many people are really displaced in Tigray region.
Can you just tell me what it was like to speak to your mother after not being able to talk to her for months on end?
Well, I couldn't stop crying because I didn't know she was actually alive. It was very emotional. Hearing her voice was a blessing to hear her again, because I didn't know any of my relatives are going to be alive. So although many of my friends' families are killed, I was lucky to hear her voice and then my other siblings.
I can't even imagine what it must be like to experience that. And, as someone who's been so affected by this, your family's been so affected by this, your friends have been so affected, what do you want to see done by global powers to intervene, to help? What do you want to see happen? What does your family want to see happen?
I think what my family and me and other Tigrayan diaspora, even the people of Tigray, asking is an immediate humanitarian assistance. This must be because more than half of the population of Tigray, about 4.5 million people, are still starving. They don't have food to eat. So if there is no humanitarian assistance we're gonna see the worst starvation happen in the world, because the government is systematically, not only killing or looting their food or other things, but are systematically blocking aid. So the UN keeps saying for the past 2 months, we need to give aid to the people. And then about a week ago, the Red Cross from, I believe it's the chairman or the director is saying 80% of the people of Tigray are not receiving aid. So I think humanitarian assistance is extremely important. That must be done. The Western, including European, and then including the US, need to pressure the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and then they need to make sure that aid need to be accessed. The other important thing is, among others, you might heard about Amnesty International report, which is out yesterday. 800 people are killed in Aksum city. Period. A lot of priests are dying by Eritrean governments, by Eritrean troops. These people are they told to kill people in Tigray as young as 12 years old and older. Any boys that moves around, they need to be killed. If they don't move, the house is closed. They just shot people. So the other important thing is Eritrean forces, they need to leave from Ethiopia. They need to leave immediately, because those are the one they are creating a lot of problem in there. So I think, to me, the first and the most important urgents are this, but all other than that, also there are others. Stop killing other people, stop raping women. They rape as young as 7 years old. As 80 years old women are raped. They ask family members, watching or raping to each other so that they can watch them. This is really insanity going on there. So this is also a follow-up. Raping in Tigray should be stopped. Killing in Tigray should be stopped. So the Western they have a power to do that and to stop this kind of insanity.
Now, the fighting, the raping, the pillaging, do you blame that on the Ethiopian government forces? Do you blame the TPLF? Who is doing the atrocities?
So the atrocity is done based on my readings, based on international news now reporting it. The TPLF did not really fight or stay in the city. All this raping is happening in the city, from Aksum to Mekelle to Wukro, everywhere in the region. They come and just rape women. And then some of the Tigray people ask, why are you even doing this? Even the Eritrean and Tigrayans, they speak the similar language. There is a common language called Tigrinya they speak, and they ask them, why are you doing this? And then they said they got order from the government to just do this deliberately. So in my mind, TPLF they are not doing this. It is the government of Eritrea. It's the government of Ethiopia systematically asking their arms to do whatever they want. They can destroy anything they want. They can rape women if they want. They can loot. That's what they were doing for the past 3 months. So as far as I know from my own talking to my family and then other relatives, and then based on other news agency, the raping is happening by the Eritrea army and then by Ethiopian armies.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add, either on the topic of your family, things that they've relayed to you, the topic of intervening by global powers? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think, like I said, I think that humanitarian assistance is a key for me at this point. I'm really, really scared to kind of, thinking about, what's going to happen. I can imagine people, more than 50,000 unarmed civilians are killed. This is just a figure already documented in the cities. Who knows what's happening in the rural areas? But more can be harmful. More could come really to wipe the Tigray of people if food is not accessible, if clean water is not accessible. You can imagine if there is some sort of infectious disease. It could be cholera. It could be other types of these diseases are erupted in Tigray. I can imagine what kind of disasters can happen. So I think the international community, the UN, the US, and the European Union have an obligation to really do this as soon as possible. Then a follow-up is they need to find a way kind of negotiation between the TPLF and the Ethiopian army. This kind of war is nonsense. No one is going to win on this war. The people of Tigray are suffering, and then this needs to stop. And then to add to this problem, like I said, it is the Eritrean army causing a lot of problem. Even though the US is said that they have evidence Eritreans are involved in this killing, and then in the war, even the European unions are saying that word is not going to work. Action is important. We need action, and we need action now. So I think I'm hoping the United States and European Union and the United Nations have worked together to really stop this madness as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Engeda Hagos, for speaking with me today and relaying your family's experiences on the ground. Again, remarkably sorry for your losses, and I wish all of the best for your family.
Thank you so much, Ila, for having me today on your program. Appreciate it.
Thank you to Engeda Hagos for sharing his and his family's deeply personal story. Around the World reached out to the Ethiopian government for comment, and as of February 26th, has yet to hear back. That will do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank you to producer Cassidy Slamman, reporter Connor Donnelly, and researchers Daniel Gall, Matt McDermott, Urvi Gandhi, and Crystal Bermudez. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you think.